It's important we look at the facts.
Politics has to be about service.
A modern form of national service.
The outcome, that's for the voters to decide.
Hi, welcome back to Planet Holyrood. I'm Lorna Hughes, editor of the Sunday Mail, and I'm joined today by the paper's political editor, John Ferguson, for our daily election podcast. With us today is James Mitchell, Professor at Edinburgh University, who's an expert on the Constitution, the Scottish Parliament, the government and public reform. So let's dive right in, get started. Professor Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us today. One of the things that I wanted to speak about, it looks like the SNP government are publishing the new poverty figures, and they are up yet again. Given that the First Minister, has made it his top priority, as have previous First Ministers, is this likely to be another problem for the party fighting in the UK election?
Well, first, thanks for the invitation to speak, and that's a great starting question, and it's the kind of question I hope that we hear asked of the politicians throughout this campaign, because it's a hugely important matter. I think one of the things that I've found over a long number of years a bit frustrating is that we get politicians who talk about prioritising poverty and they're going to end poverty or close the attainment gap in education and so on and so forth. And all of that is very glib and easy to say. The question that I always want to ask is, how are you going to do it? How are you actually going to do it? Not what you want to do. We all want to see the end of poverty, but how are you going to do it? And it's disappointing to hear the SNP continually saying that they're going to address poverty, but not really tell us how it's going to be done and really explain how they're going to reverse what has been going on for far too long. Nor do we want to hear excuses. It's easy to blame others. And there's no doubt at all that policies coming out of Westminster are not helping, and indeed are harming the Scottish society, contributing to that. There's no doubt that we've got a COVID legacy as well. And then there's a Brexit legacy, taking all of that together. But, I always think it's a bit like, when you're trying to get from A to B in your bike or in your car, and you think you can do it in an hour, and then you hit a bit in the road where, if you're on your bike, you have to pedal harder, you have to work harder, you have to change your gear. Well, that's what governments need to do. They need to change the gear. They not just say, oh, we've got a problem, we've hit a bit in the road that we didn't anticipate. You've got to do something more. And I'm not hearing that from the government, and that disappoints me.
What gear change are you talking about then, Professor?
Well, I think for me, one of the most important would be the child payment, the Scottish child payment. There is no doubt at all that the introduction of that has made a difference. And so all credit for that, and all credit to all those who campaigned for it, credit to the Scottish Government for introducing it. But when they introduced it, it was introduced with a fanfare, and it was all about, look what we're doing and all the rest of it. It was all about presentation, or too much of it was about presentation, in fairness. And I think if you're going to take this seriously, you've got to go beyond where they are at the moment. It's got to be increased. It's got to go up to £30 per person per week initially, beyond where we are, and we've got to aim to get to over £40 if we're really going to make a difference. We've also got to look at things like, freezing the council tax. I mean, if you freeze the council tax, you are helping the better off. You're not helping the less well off. So we've got to start being honest about these things and really stopping doing things that are actually undermining what the government claims it wants to do. And I think that's a message not just for the SNP and government, it's a message for all the political parties. If we are serious about tackling poverty, then we're going to have to make some pretty difficult decisions, some bold decisions, and we're going to have to start redistributing wealth, taking money away from those who have it and giving it to those who don't. Now, that's easy for me to say, because of course I'm not seeking election, probably wouldn't get elected to anything, but if we're serious about these targets and serious about tackling poverty, we've got to start doing things like that. And I say that's just a start. There are so many other things that need to be done. Poverty is a really complex matter. It's not something that can be solved easily. There's no single silver bullet. There's a whole range of matters that need to be addressed. We've got contracts that people have in work. The kind of short-term contracts, all the rest of it. All of that is really damaging, and it's contributing really badly to the social fabric of Scotland. So let's hear not just what people want, but how they're going to do it, and actually put the money where their mouth is.
I think with this issue, there is a certain sense that in a little bit like the Conservatives seem to set themselves up for failure with their constant constantly saying that they're going to reduce immigration figures, and without really having a proper plan to do that. Instead, they've got gimmicks like the Rwanda policy and everything else. The SNP kind of set themselves up for failure by constantly making ending poverty in a very general sense their big election promise and policy promise in new parliaments, without really having a way to do it. Like you say, there's such a myriad of factors affecting poverty, not least just the fact that the Western economies like ours are reducing generally in their influence and levels of wealth that they're being able to distribute for the less well-paid people in the country. And so it's a very difficult thing to promise to do and to achieve without having a really radical policy agenda to do it. And it does feel like it's always something they just think, well, in 5 years maybe something will have changed to make this miraculously come true, but that's not going to happen, is it?
No, well, it hasn't. It hasn't in 17. Is it 17 years, Professor? Yeah. I mean, it hasn't gone. It hasn't changed at all, and that's an indictment to, because I mean, I don't think England's figures are brilliant either.
No. Well, and I think John makes a really important point about the world conditions. There's no doubt at all that makes a big difference, and also about kind of longer term objectives, because these kind of things aren't going to be solved overnight. But you've got to start somewhere. And I'm very much struck by the fact that if you go back, way back to 1997 when Labour first came to power, back then, or not first time came to power, but back in 1997, and Labour had a whole bold strategy on poverty, and it had a mixed effect. It was certainly better than we've seen under the SNP. I mean, certainly when you look at child poverty, it didn't decline as much as they'd hoped for. But pensioners' poverty really did, and in work poverty was dealt with. So things can be done, and I think it's right and proper that we talk about these issues and we get people to make commitments. But behind that needs to be the policies, the action, the bold action. And as I say, it can be done. And there's no doubt at all that back then the international, global kind of economic situation was much better and made that much easier. But for me, that means you've got to work even harder now.
Yeah, is that the problem though, that this government, who have been in power for 17 years, it's about, well, we can use the term, style over substance, but actually not doing the work that needs to be done, announcing things. I mean, John and I have sat through everything from free bikes to laptops to, and I think what's happened is that there's been a malaise and people have gone, we can't afford this, or this isn't going to work. And now, we're in this mess of where there isn't the work that's been done to actually, implement things properly that would make a difference.
I think that's a really important point. And I think one of the things that the SNP has been outstandingly good at is communication, and it talks a good game, and it's been quite brilliant at that, frankly. But hidden behind that, has been a pretty poor performance in office. And I think what's now happening, having been in office for so long, is that people are beginning to twig and say, hold on, you talk a good game, but what's actually happening? And I think, in a sense, they've been found out, as it were. And it's taken a long time. But I think we're now at that point when people are beginning to get a bit weary of hearing all the good talk. Having said that, listening and watching the SNP Parliamentary Party political broadcast last evening, I think they're actually losing their skill in terms of communication as well, because that was possibly one of the worst broadcasts the SNP's produced in a very long time. So I think it's not just that they haven't performed very well in office. I think they're now beginning to lose the one thing that they did have going for them for a very long time, and that was great communication skills.
Now, I wonder whether you think that the reducing poverty can be done at the same time as prioritising to such an extent the net zero commitment. We've written quite a lot the last few weeks. We've done some work with the unions where they've been saying, well, there just isn't the plan in place. If you think that the North Sea shouldn't be new exploration there, you're just not going to be able to replace those jobs. And it almost feels to me like there's an unsayable thing in politics that fine, if you want to pursue net zero, you could do that, but that does kind of mean that people need to accept potentially becoming a bit poorer, because that's ultimately you're only going to solve these problems by reducing consumption. So it feels like there's two big policies there that, you know, the SNP like to put front and centre of their agenda, but I don't know if you can do them both at the same time.
No, I think one of the things about the trying to address the climate challenge is that I mean it has to be a transition, and that's going to be painful and it's going to be slow, and there's no doubt at all it will have a hit on the overall economy. Now that to me leads to one conclusion: if you are serious about poverty, then if the cake is shrinking, you're going to have to seriously look at redistribution. That's the only way you can do it, and there's no appetite in the government for that. There's not much appetite in our politics for this. I think one of the great myths about Scotland is this particularly left-wing radical place. Scotland's actually quite small c conservative. Certainly, if you look at what the parties are saying and you look at the actions of our politicians, there's not really much evidence of great boldness. And so what you tend to find, I think, in Scotland is that we talk a good game, we sound left, but actually our actions are anything but. And so we're not really getting to grips with some of these issues. But you're right, the whole net zero business is adding to the challenge, is making it much more difficult. But again, I come back to my point, is that if it is more difficult, you just have to work harder to achieve those goals if you are serious about tackling poverty, as we keep being told that parties in government are. So I think you're right. It just adds to the difficulties and the challenge.
Do you feel there might be a day of reckoning coming for the SNP then? You know, you're now paying quite considerably more tax in Scotland if you're over, say, £30,000 a year in the earnings. Do you think that the fact that Scotland, if you feel it really is actually a conservative with a small c type of society, that there is going to be a reckoning for the SNP at the ballot box when people are looking and they're thinking, well, I'm paying thousands of pounds more tax by living in Scotland, and I'm just not seeing better public services?
Yeah, I mean, I think for quite some time now, it's been becoming ever more evident that there's something badly wrong in terms of public services. And I think that is getting through to the electorate, and we're seeing that in the opinion polls. And I think that's one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why the SNP is not doing as well as it was only a few years ago. And I don't see that as easily reversed. And clearly what we're also seeing is that people are now much more focused on everyday concerns about the state of the health services, schools, and jobs, all the rest of it, all these things that happen to us and affect us in our daily lives. These things are now much more important than the big constitutional debate. And so I think as the shift has taken place away from constitutional politics onto everyday matters, and combined with that is a sense that, hell, they're not delivering for us, that is having an effect. And I think that's one of the reasons, not the only reason, but I think that's one of the reasons the SNP is going to lose seats at this election and will be in trouble come the next Holyrood elections, unless they can do something very dramatic to reverse that. And I don't see any signs of that happening, at least not as yet.
It's interesting you say that, Professor Mitchell. I mean, obviously, the SNP Swinney said the other night that independence is the first thing that's on the manifesto. Now, they're not talking an awful lot about independence. They're realising that people in the doors are obviously possibly saying other things to them. But you hinted at this quite recently that, are the SNP almost, or could it be for the first time, they're becoming irrelevant in this UK election?
Well, yes. I mean, I think one of the things they were saying just a few years ago, remember, with Nicola Sturgeon talking about this de facto referendum. This is what this election was going to be, a de facto referendum. They were going to win 50% of the vote, and then they were going to declare independence and so on and so forth. And even more recently, we had Humza Yousaf and Stephen Flynn talking about kind of this election was going to be the independence referendum. It was going to be a majority of seats in Scotland. Well, since then, they've been playing that issue down further and further. And it was really interesting, John Swinney's opening statement last night didn't use the word independence at all. He avoided saying the I word. He talked about Scottish control of Scottish affairs and such like. So it was a much more watered down thing. And therein lies a problem, because if independence is at the top of the agenda, and if there's support for independence over 40%, doesn't even have to be 50%, given the electoral system. That's really good news for the SNP. But as it's slipping off the agenda or down the agenda, that's bad news. And if voters are going into the polling booths and they're thinking, well, what's the big issue in my mind? Is it about getting a new government in London? Is it about who's been Prime Minister? The SNP doesn't look very relevant. And so the relevance issue kicks in a way that it hasn't when independence has been top of the agenda. We could be going back to that kind of situation we had in UK elections in Scotland before 2015, when the SNP struggled. Remember, go back to, just even before the SNP won its overall majority in Holyrood in that 2011 Holyrood elections. The year before, in the 2010 elections, the SNP did not do very well at all. The Liberal Democrats got more seats and more votes than the SNP in that election. So while the SNP was doing really well for Holyrood elections, it wasn't doing at all well because it was not seen as relevant. You weren't going to get an SNP Prime Minister. And I think that's where the SNP could be heading back to, if not immediately at this election, then certainly in that direction at this election. And that ought to be a major concern. So they don't want to talk about independence because the people don't want to talk about it, but they don't really have another good reason other than this kind of vague notion that if you vote for us, it'll keep Scotland on the agenda, and the kind of holding the feet to the fire kind of notion that the SNP has used in the past. But I'm not convinced it's going down very well, and certainly not amongst those people who, in the last few elections, Westminster elections, have supported the SNP. So I think they are struggling with the relevance question, as it were.
I thought there was an interesting moment in the debate yesterday where John Swinney was being cross-examined by, was it an ass? And he said, well, this time round you're saying don't vote Labour because Labour are going to walk it anyway. Last time round you said don't vote Labour because they're not going to win. And an ass sir was kind of saying, so when should you vote Labour? And I thought that was a very interesting thing. John Swinney was almost very cynically saying, well, just never vote Labour because they'll either get in or they won't get in. But if you vote for the SNP, then no matter who's in, we are just going to agitate more for more resources and more money to get sent to Scotland. And in some ways you could see how that maybe kind of makes sense to the SNP, but I don't think it's a long-term strategy. It's a very cynical way of looking at things, and I think without a kind of wider ideological reason for people to vote for you, I just can't see it being very successful in the long run. It does feel like the SNP are now in this almost existential crisis where if they don't do well in this election and they really are on the slide out of things for another decade, maybe 20 years, then it kind of, even if you've got opinion polls that say that half of people would theoretically quite like an independent Scotland, there's no chance of it ever happening, and it's probably just going to drift out of people's minds again without a really radical shift in our politics.
I mean, we probably should say that come the 2026 elections and things, could change, but they could still be the largest party, obviously, at Holyrood. I mean, that's the interesting thing. And I suppose that leads into, do you think they've been mired in scandal and sleaze, and, you can take your pick. If none of that had happened, so forget about Matheson, who obviously is facing no police action today, but the damage is already done. But if that didn't happen, if there hadn't been the WhatsApp scandals, would we still be in the same position because they're not delivering on their promises?
Yeah, I think the Holyrood elections are different from Westminster elections because the SNP does have a relevance in that they are in power and could still be in power. So that gives them a relevance. However, the problem for the SNP about that is it's on their record. That's what they were standing on the record come the next Holyrood elections. And that's not a great record. And it was notable that each of the last evening very much emphasised scandal, ferries, and so on and so forth. And as soon as people hear the word scandal, it's not just the ferries people are thinking about, they also think about police inquiries. The opposition party leaders didn't have to mention that, but clearly that was in people's minds when that was being said. So I think there's a kind of big issue there for the SNP as they go into the next Holyrood elections. And that's a particular problem, I think, for John Swinney, who's presented, and to some extent, I think, can claim to be more honest and decent and all the rest of it. But the problem is, and again, this was emphasised last night by his opponents, he has been at the heart of Scottish government for the last 17 years. He was the number 2 to Nicola Sturgeon. He was the education secretary and so on and so forth. So he can't entirely say, it wasn't me, I had nothing to do with that. He was so centrally involved. And so I think when we get to the Holyrood elections, it will be very much about the competence of the government, the record of the government, and that, I think, will be very difficult for the SNP unless they can do something very dramatic. And as I say, I just don't see any sign of that happening. And I would also stress that I think if the SNP does very poorly in these elections, as looks likely, then they're going to lose all these MPs, all the resources that go with it, the short money, the money that's given to opposition parties in the House of Commons. That's a significant amount of money. And the SNP, we know, don't have much money. So they're going to lose all of those resources. But actually, even more important, I think, is morale. Morale in the SNP is going to be hit hard. I mean, a lot of these activists, especially the younger ones who've been coming in over the last few years, really since the independence referendum, they haven't experienced this kind of defeat. They're not used to it. And a lot of them will just walk away. I'm sure of that. Well, we already know, and as John's found out and pointed out before, the membership has been declining and very significantly, and they tried to hide that. But I think they'll lose even more members. And when you get into that situation, parties tend to start looking very much inwards. There's blame games. Everybody else gets the blame inside the party, bloodletting, and it can be very, very difficult. And that will be a challenge for the SNP leader, who will also still be trying to manage the country, to lead the country as First Minister. So I think he's going to have some big challenges ahead, especially if, as looks fairly likely, they're going to have some significant losses after this election.
Yeah, that does seem like a significant problem for the SNP now, doesn't it? That the criticism of their party political broadcast yesterday, and I guess the most likely reason for that not being very good was that they didn't have much money to spend on it. We know that the Conservatives have got the business lobby, they bankroll their campaigning. Labour have got the unions. It's a big problem for the SNP if they don't have all of these activists that are willing to give their time for free, and B, the membership money that allows them to pay for all the things that you need to win an election. It's a big problem, isn't it?
Well, I think one of the interesting things, and I'm going to try and plug a book that we've just written on the membership of the SNP, Surge's membership. We did a survey of SNP members just after the surge. We're really intrigued because it's very rare for a political party to see the kind of surge in membership that the SNP experienced after 2014. And one of the interesting things is that many of these members, now accepting that they didn't quite have the members that they were claiming it's latterly, they were passive members. They're not people who had any intention of being very active. So the big number, the headlines, or whatever it would have been, 125, 100,000, whatever, most of these were never going to be active. So they don't have the kind of troops on the ground that they were claiming. And obviously now that number, whatever it really was, has been in decline anyway. So I think they have that problem. And as you say, I mean, I think that the money's gone. I think that part of political broadcast for me was really intriguing last evening, because I thought the one thing that they still have, they've got people in their headquarters, they've got these contacts with what they call the creatives, people in the arts and so on and so forth, and communication. And I thought, well, they should be able to put together, even on the cheap, a good party political broadcast. But that was dire. That was amateurish. It was embarrassingly bad. And, Kate Forbes she's a clever woman, but that was just, that was like, acting at its worst. And I can't believe they couldn't have done something better. And that makes me wonder what's going on inside the SNP, because, they could have done something so much better, even though maybe they were caught off guard, didn't expect the election, even though they don't have much money, but they do have, or did have, these so-called creatives, these people who were supposed to be very good at that. So it was an intriguing part of political broadcast from that point of view. They do seem to be losing that one thing that they certainly have had for many years, which is quite, I think, skillful communication abilities.
It does feel like they're on a bit of a hiding to nothing, just like the Conservatives who've been in power for a very long time. And, Rishi Sunak, he can't say he's going to watch the football without it becoming a 3-day negative story. And a sort of similar way, it does just feel like that no matter what the SNP try and do, it's not going to work, and that it's going to be cast in some kind of negative light. And it's always, I don't know if there's many examples in British political history of a party being able to stay in power and popular for more than 2-3 political terms.
Yeah, I think they need something dramatic to happen. It may well be something external. I mean, we know that if it was like wars can help a governing party and such like, not that would necessarily help the SNP, but I think they need something dramatic either externally to happen or some big change. But the truth is, there's not much change there. There's an awful lot more continuity. Bringing Kate Forbes into the cabinet and leaving the rest of the cabinet there, it's still the Sturgeon cabinet. This is not an impressive cabinet. The opportunity was there to do something dramatic, to really bring in others. But then there is the question, as people have asked, who would he bring in? So I think, you're right. It's difficult to see what he could do. And he certainly doesn't seem to know what he should do to reverse this. And I think, it's success breeds success, but failure breeds failure as well. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're on that downward trajectory. It's building up speed. And I suspect it's now going to be almost impossible to reverse.
I think the SNP and the Tories are both in that downward trajectory. I mean, you can see it, as John said, from the gaffes. But who, of course, arrives back, out of nowhere is Nigel Farage. I mean, today, obviously, he's had a milkshake, I think it was, chucked at him. Yep. And I think a couple of people have been arrested. But I mean, John's got an interesting theory that I know he wants to speak to you about, but you just couldn't make this up. We've now got this man back, and it looks like he certainly in England will split the Tory vote. I mean, John, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I just thought an interesting way of looking at it. Clearly, it looks like Nigel Farage feels like, he is the guy that can either usurp the Conservatives, not necessarily at this election, but in a future election, or potentially take over the Conservatives. He feels like he is the voice of Conservative thinking in Britain. And I guess the interesting comparison is that in Scotland, we have a similar kind of, controversial but very interesting maverick in Alex Salmond, who is also has obviously been the leader and a very successful First Minister and leader of the SNP, but has now started a new party who, rather like Reform, are unlikely to get to win any seats in this election. But come the next Holyrood election, he'll have a proportional system. There's a very good chance that he could, if things go in his favour, end up with quite a few MSPs. And I just wonder whether you think that he, in some ways, could, pose a similar, I guess you would say, either threat to the SNP or perhaps be the SNP's saviour, and that when he was in the leader of the SNP, they were a very popular party. You have to remember that was against the backdrop of the financial crisis and all the rest of it, introduced lots of very popular policies that remain the SNP's biggest achievement. So I just wonder whether you think there could be a way back for Alex Salmond and Alba into, being a force and potentially either teaming up with the SNP or rejoining with the SNP in the future.
I think that one of the differences is that within the Conservative Party, there's a lot of support for Farage, and I see one of their MPs is actually pleading with them to not cause them trouble, and that he should be in the Conservative Party and such like. In the SNP, there's real hostility to Alex Salmond, and I think that it'd be very difficult to see him certainly rejoining the SNP, or even, I think, having some kind of alliance with them. I think it would take a dramatic change inside the SNP for that to happen. That's not to say it couldn't happen, but I think it would be difficult. You're right. I think the electoral system makes it easier for a small party to kind of get a foothold in the parliament, but it's still very, very difficult. And I guess part of the problem he will face is that independence, which is the big selling issue for Alba, is in decline as an issue, and so therefore he's not going to be able to harness support for independence in support for his party, unless he can actually bring in people from the SNP. I think the impact that Alba is likely to have will be less on the wider public, but more on the SNP itself and some of the internal politics of the SNP over the next few years. Much will depend on what happens, in a whole range of areas, let's say, and if he feels vindicated and is perceived to be vindicated in any shape or form. So I think, I would never rule the possibility of him coming back. I think he has been, looking back over my career in politics, it goes back over 40 years. I mean, he's certainly been one of the most significant figures. He can change things, but he's starting from a very difficult position now. It's just very difficult. And I suspect, if they were going to make a breakthrough at all, they should have made it by now, Alba. And so I'm not sure. And, he's not young as well. I mean, there gets to a point when, the time's up for you. And I suspect that is the case. If I had to make a prediction, and I'll regret doing this because I'll be wrong, I'm sure, but if I had to make a prediction, I think that over a long period of time, when the SNP goes into opposition, a lot of the people who joined Alba will rejoin the SNP, but it'll be a very different SNP. And I think the SNP, if and when it ever comes back, will be led by someone that none of us here know who it will be, because there'll be somebody that's unknown at this stage. It'll take that long, and it'll be a very different party. And I think this period in our politics, and I'm talking about the last decade or so, will be a very, very painful period for the SNP and for nationalists generally to reflect upon. So I guess I think you're right. There are few change makers in politics, few politicians who really have that skill, who've got that strategic brain that he has, that Farage's got in many respects. Very few who can do that. And as I look around, I'm certainly not seeing anybody in the mainstream parties with those skills at the moment.
Do you think when the SNP does reinvent itself that it will be more in line with the kind of values that that Salmond kind of promoted when he was the leader, i.e. they're going to be more business friendly, there's going to be a bit more of a realpolitik, that if you want to be successful as a small part of a bigger economy, then the way to do that's to be competitive in tax and to do things that are going to get inward investment, that you're going to support things like the North Sea oil industry and promote its success as one of your real strengths. Do you think it would be that sort of policy agenda that a new SNP will be?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the SNP to succeed, on any party to succeed, you've got to talk to Scotland and listen to Scotland and recognise that Scotland isn't quite as progressive, in my view, sadly so, as many people like to think. And I always think that Jimmy Maxson was right when he said, if you can't ride on two horses at once, you shouldn't be in the bloody circus. And I think what Alex Salmond was really good at doing is riding two horses. He was capable of going and speaking to a business audience and being heard, listened to, respected and believed, and then going to an audience of trade unionists and the same would happen. Very few people have got that ability to do that and to develop policies that were on the one hand seen as supportive of each and every section of or almost every section of Scottish society, and to build up that kind of coalition. And I think, you saw that not just in terms of the different societal groups, but you saw that in terms of Scottish geography, so that the SNP could command support in the fishing villages and the farming communities in the northeast, but also in urban Scotland in the West Central Belt and Glasgow. And it looks as if at the end of this era of the SNP, the kind of Sturgeon era, the SNP is going to have lost both, or a good chunk of both, and that I think is going to be very difficult to rebuild. And so it will take kind of not just an individual, but an individual leader is important. It's also need the kind of strategic thinking that can build again that kind of coalition and link it to constitutional change that frankly has been absent from the SNP for the last decade.
And govern well, and then you can persuade people.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point too. I should have made that point because, of course, the SNP came to power in 2007 by emphasising that they would govern competently. And if you look at what happened in 2011, when the only time any parties won an overall majority, the surveys we did at that time and the Scottish election studies showed pretty clearly that the reason the SNP won so well was because people perceived them to be competent across the wide range, all the issues, on every single issue that was devolved. When we asked people which party is best capable of governing Scotland, it was the SNP was miles ahead on all of the issues. That was the basis of their support. Actually, independent support didn't rise between 2007 and 11. It came afterwards. But the base was to convince people who could govern competently. And let's face it, if you're thinking about independence, if you're open-minded about it, you're unlikely to support it if the party that's advocating it is perceived by you to not be very competent. How can you have confidence in an independent Scotland that's going to be governed by a party you think isn't up to governing devolution? So I think the SNP has lost sight of that very important thing, or at least it took it for granted. I think that's what happened over the last decade is the SNP just took for granted that they had this reputation and kind of lost sight of that. But ultimately, that's crucial and will always be crucial for the SNP and indeed for other political parties. And I'm not saying that's easy. It's not easy, but that's a challenge. And as I say, I just don't see much sign of even a willingness to acknowledge that in the SNP, far less to come up with a strategy that builds on that understanding.
Professor Mitchell, that's fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, you'll be able to see this Planet Holyrood on the Daily Records YouTube channel, and we will be back again tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.
It's important we look at the facts. Politics has to be about service.
A modern form of national service.
The outcome, that's for the voters to decide.